Welcome to Game of Thrones Abridged on Alt Swift X, episode 71, John 9. This episode's a little later than we was planning. We were gonna wrap up book one a bit sooner than this, but you know how time is. You look one way, you look another, left and right and left again before you cross the street, but it's like Frogger. Some 16-wheeler just comes out of nowhere and smacks you temporally, and you don't know which way was when. It just happens. Bam! There goes a decade. Whoopah! There goes half a century. I'm 88. Who is this? I got arthritis. I can't... What's a wingding, You know how it is. So that happened. Other things happened. It's almost as though life is a whole just sequence of events, just linear, sometimes not linear. I'm not going to judge. If you want to be crooked, whichever direction. If you want to be diagonal, we don't judge here. This is Alt Swift X. Welcome. Without further ado, let's begin John 9. This is the final Jon Snow chapter in A Game of Thrones. And it is an important one for his whole direction of his character, his identity, who he is, what his goal in life is. But the chapter starts quite simply with a wicker. And a wicker, of course, is a sound that a horse makes. It's like the equine equivalent of a snicker, maybe, or like a harumph, or like. Have you heard a horse do a wicker? It's like a. No, it's not. It's not that. It's like I can't wicker. That's why it's. That's why it's yeah. But he does a wicker while Jon is tightening the cinch. I don't know what a cinch is. Maybe it's like a wicker. But the point is that Jon's bringing his horsey out in the night for a little nighttime gallop, a little trot in the evening. As my uncle used to call it, an evening. And so he's taking his horsey out and he's whispering, and it's cold. There's a cold, dead breath on his face. The wind is a cold, dead breath, which of course immediately sets us up for some spookery. There's a dark, ominous tone when we're talking about cold, dead breath. Of course, it evokes the cold, dead zombie who Jon fought not so long ago. The rising winter. Winter is coming. Jon Snow. And his scarred fingers. Remember he burned his hand when he fought the White that was trying to kill Jeor Mormont, and so that's another reminder of the zombies. So Jon's not thinking explicitly about zombies right now, but we as readers, like thematically, there are lots of hints of the whole Zumbini catastrophe that's lurking in the background. But he's taken his horsey out, and he's confronted by Samwell Tarly. Samwell Tarly is doing a long bottom, as we say. He's doing a Neville, and that doesn't mean suddenly turning from a gawky white kid into a strapping young man like Neville did, going through a veritable second puberty, or a first one. Anyways, but what Sam's doing is he's doing the Neville. By which I mean he's trying to stop the hero from going out and doing something heroic, basically. Remember in Chamber of Secrets, I think, when Harry's like, I've got to fight the basilisk, Ron. And then Neville's like, no, you'll lose house points. And he tries to stop Harry from going out, and then Hermione's like, Petrificus totalis. And then Neville he fails to stop Harry. That's what's happening here. So Sam is like, no, Jon, you mustn't go out on your wickering horse. You mustn't ride off into the dark. You must stay at the Night's Watch. Because what Jon's trying to do right now is that he's like, I gotta go help the Starks. The Starks are marching in war against the Lannisters because Ned Stark has been executed, so I must be with my family. But Sam is arguing, no, you swore the oaths to stay with the Night's Watch and to man the wall. That is your identity now. That is your family now. That is your duty. That is your honor, and so you must stay here. But Jon's like, fuck you, Neville. I'm out. John out. Snow out. I'm a blizzard. And he blizzards his way off on his horse, is what happens. He charges at Sam and forces him to jump aside before John runs him down, because he is serious. So Sam, like Neville, ends up with his face in the dirt or on the carpet of the Gryffindor common room. And Ghost is racing at John's side. John's direwolf Ghost, who gets a lot of cardio done throughout this series, actually, if you pay attention. Ghost does a lot of running. He does a lot of keeping up with John, and whole periods of sort of disappearing for a while and being out hunting and off doing his own sort of ghosty business, especially in the show, of course. There are whole sort of seasons where we don't see Ghost, and he's presumably doing something important. Do you ever get the feeling that all the animals are just up to something in their own little mammalian world? Like the horses are wickering, you know. They know things. The crows are talking about kings. There's a horse called the Stranger, like some kind of death horse. Do you ever wonder if there's like this whole meta narrative going on behind Game of Thrones about like the heroics of Jaime's horse Honor, who's fighting against the Dark Lord Stranger and all of the animal? Well, I guess it's connected to the old gods and whatever, but you know, horses, they can't be trusted. And so John's off for a ride. He's planning to abandon the Night's Watch and go and join his family, his brethren, the Starks, in their fight against the hated Lannisters. That is what he sees as what he needs to do. And he's flexing his burned hand as he goes, which becomes a sort of a tick, a bit of a habit throughout the series. His burned hand, like Aemon, I think, told him to flex it so that it heals properly, and you don't end up with your hand healed into a fist. That would be embarrassing. So he keeps on flexing his hand, and he keeps doing that throughout the series, which is perhaps not only therapy for his hand, but it's a reminder of some of the dangers that he's faced, and it's a reminder perhaps to not stick his hand in fire again. My arms are fiddly. And so he's going for a ride, and he thinks about how he left Longclaw, the sword that Jeor Mormont gave him. He left Longclaw behind at Castle Black because he figures, I might be a bastard, I might be a deserter of the Night's Watch, I might have shit for honor, but I'm not as bad as Jorah Mormont. And even Jorah Mormont left his sword behind when he abandoned the North, when he abandoned the Mormonts. And so I'll do the same. I'll leave Longclaw behind. And he thinks about the conflict and the pain of having to make Jorah Mormont feel bad, because he's like, oh, you know, Lord Commander Mormont put his trust in me and my faith in me by handing over this sword, and I'm betraying him by abandoning the Watch, his baby. He loves the Watch, and I'm leaving. And so this tension makes John think that, well, no matter what I do, I feel like I'm betraying someone. I'm either betraying Jorah by leaving the Night's Watch, or I'm betraying my family, the Starks, by staying at the Night's Watch. No matter what you do, you're screwing someone over, which echoes, I think, Jaime's quote about, like, honor. He says about the oaths. They make you swear so many oaths. They make you swear for the king, for the country, protect the weak, listen to your father, do all the different things. But you can't do anything without breaking some oath or another, Jaime complains, and I think this is similar. And it's one of the themes of Game of Thrones, is being pulled in all these different directions by all these different desires and duties and responsibilities. And that's why this is good fiction, partly, I think, because we all feel a little bit of that. And he thinks about the gods. We have a relatively rare moment, I think, of John thinking, what would Jesus do? He thinks about, what my religion of the old gods, what does that tell me about this difficult decision that I'm trying to make? He figures that, oh, well, people who follow the faith of the Seven, they have it easier because they've got these septons, they've got these priests to tell them what's right and what's wrong. Just give them 3 Hail Marys and a Holy Ghost, and your sins are cleansed. Give me some of those indulgences, mate. That's what Catholicism's like. But John's like, the old gods are a trickier religion, because the old gods usually don't talk back. When you ask the old gods, what should I do, they tend not to answer apart from the language of the leaves that Osher talks about. So perhaps in that way, the old gods is a more individualistic religion. There's no church of the old gods that tells you this is sin, this is virtue. You just got to work out your own path to some extent, perhaps. When Ned Stark prays to the old gods and sits and strokes his masturbatory Valyrian steel sword and goes, what should I do? The answer has to come from within, doesn't it? So maybe in that way, the old gods is an individualistic religion. Anyway, well, I mean, of course, except really, if you're practicing the old gods properly, you're probably all connected up like Bloodraven is to the whole hive mind of the children of the forest and the dead greenseers and all of that, which is probably the opposite of individualism, isn't it? It's like a hive mind thing, especially if you get all Preston Jacobs about it and look at the all of George Martin's sci-fi shit, and so that's sort of the opposite of individualism, isn't it? So there's a contradiction, there's a tension between the way people practice the religion and the perhaps higher, more mystical realities of that religion, which some people would say is true of religions in the real world, right? Some people argue that, like, Christianity, or, I'm sure they say it about other religions, but, Christianity, the church does not represent the true word of Jesus or whatever, and that's why there are so many goddamn churches. You ever notice there's the Presbyterians, and there's the Seventh-day Adventists, and there's the Mormons who have a whole new holy book and shit, like people keep disagreeing over what the true word is, so they end up making another fucking word. There's too many words, so that's a problem. But John's struggling with this. He feels like he's not getting a lot of answers from religion, which is true of most of the characters in Game of Thrones, isn't it? They don't seem to get much guidance from religion. Some people do, obviously. Many people do, but not George Martin's characters very much, which might say something about George Martin's perspective. He clearly recognizes the political importance of religion. He certainly recognizes the interesting mystical and world-building aspects of religion, but his characters don't seem to often find religion to be a very influential voice personally in guiding their decisions. I mean, there are people like Lancel and stuff, and obviously there's like the High Sparrow, but like in terms of like main characters, the religion doesn't seem to do all that much. I mean, there's stuff going on with the Greyjoys, I suppose, but most characters seem pretty atheistic a lot of the time. Anyway, so John's riding and he's abandoning the Night's Watch, which is a problem, because if you'll recall episode 1 of this fine series, if you remember the execution of Will or of Garrett, depending on who you ask, if you desert the Night's Watch, you get executed. That's the law, and John is trying to desert the Night's Watch. So he's going to have to avoid execution, which is a problem. It's a challenge because John's wearing all black, as the Night's Watch does. His breeches, his tunic, his jerkin, his heavy wool cloak. It's like a food description, but for clothes. It's like a Sansa chapter. All of John's clothes are black, is the problem, and that makes him a target. That makes people suspicious of him. That might make people realize that he's a deserter of the Night's Watch and chop his head off. And so John's thinking about the logistics of how to not get caught. And he thinks about Winterfell. He thinks about all the features of Winterfell that he loves: the Great Hall, Bran's laughter, eating Gage's beef and bacon pies. But he had not left the Wall for that, he tells himself. The reason he left the Wall, the reason he's riding south, is because he needs to rejoin the Starks. He is his father's son and Rob's brother. And nothing can change that, he thinks. He can't be a Mormont, even if he gets Longclaw. He can't be nor was he Aemon Targaryen, John thinks. His point being that he's not a Targaryen, when of course we know that he is a Targaryen. He is at least half Targaryen. In fact, if Jon's true name, I mean, remember this season there was all this talk of Jon's true name being Aegon. What if his true name is Aemon in the books? It would be funny if that was the case, because in this first book we have Jon saying, I'm not Aemon Targaryen. It would be very George Martinian for Jon to turn out to be wrong about that and to actually be Aemon Targaryen. But the point is that this all comes down to Jon's identity. It's a bit like Theon, know your name, right? Jon's whole conflict here is about, am I a Snow? Am I a Stark? I'm not a Mormont. I'm not a Targaryen. Where do I belong? Where do I fit in? Who am I? And at this moment, he's decided that I'm a Stark, and I need to fight with my family, and that's why he's leaving the Watch. And he realizes that this makes him an oathbreaker, as well as a bastard and an outsider, motherless, friendless, and damned. He says he will be condemned for as long as he lives. He'll be the outsider. He'll be living in the shadows. I think you detect there's a certain romanticization going on here. Like, Jon's like, oh, it's going to be so hard being like this sexy adventurer who's like the dark stranger in the... Like, he thinks he's Strider, basically. Like, remember that shot when Aragorn's in the prancing pony and he's like smoking his pipe weed all seductively and shit, and he's all like, yeah, look at me, grizzled fucking ranger, man, you know? Oh, it's so tough being this handsome all the time. Like, that's kind of what Jon's got going on here, I think. Like, he's a teenager and he's thinking like, oh yeah, being an exile, it's like, oh, it's so hard. You know, that's sort of what he's getting at, I think. But he's like, yeah, that's what I'm doing. It's for the family, though. It's because I'm honor bound. It's because I've got to do it for the Starks. And he asks himself, after asking what would the old gods do and not getting answers, he asks, what would Lord Eddard do? What would Ned Stark do? And what would Ned Stark do if he had to execute his brother Benjen? He thinks that, like, oh, well, Ned Stark, you know, he killed Will easily enough. Or he killed the other bloke easily enough. But would he have killed his brother Benjen if he deserted the Night's Watch? Like this whole family honor thing is what Jon's brooding on. Love versus duty. And he feels pain deep in his fingers. But it's also evident that Jon is feeling emotional pain at the same time. So perhaps this physical pain is metaphorical, has metaphorical meaning. But he thinks... that if I must die, let me die with a sword in my hand. I'm not afraid of death, Jon says, which again is a very absurd thing for a 15-year-old to say, I think. Like, how can you not be afraid of death when you've barely started life, you know? I mean, he's being a bit of a kid about this, I think. But anyway, he's like, oh, you know, I'm no true Stark, but I can die like one. Let them say that Eddard Stark had fathered 4 sons, not 3. So he's seeing death in battle as being a way of finally joining the Stark family. So that's really what it's all about for Jon. Like, it's not about duty, or it might not even be about love. It's just about Jon wanting to have a sense of who he is in a positive way, and he feels that the Stark identity is how he needs to do that. And anyway, he's going, he passes Molestown. Molestown is this little tiny little hamlet that's south of the Wall, which is famously kind of a hobbit hole, because like half the buildings are below the ground. It's all like basements and stuff, presumably because it's so cold up there. But the main economy of Molestown, their primary import is Night's Watch dick, apparently, because the Night's Watchmen, even though they're sworn to celibacy, are always sneaking down to Molestown to, as they say, mine for buried treasures, which is a euphemism for sleeping with the sex workers there. Part of the point there being that no one seems to care when people break those particular rules, so the rules of the Night's Watch seem to be more like guidelines. Although it is disputable whether celibacy even is necessarily really part of being in the Night's Watch necessarily, because, like, I mean, we've heard the oath. It says, I will take no wife or whatever. It doesn't actually say I will not have sex. It doesn't say I will not dig for gold in Molestown. So just like, and you know, similarly with like Jon's resurrection, possibly freeing him from the oath based on the whole "it shall not end until my death" thing. Point being, yeah, maybe the rules are a little bit flexible, you know? Anyway, so Jon he's got all this internal conflict. Am I doing the right thing? Why do I feel so bad? Why is this so difficult? he's riding dangerously because there's like streams and stones around. He thinks, I could easily trip and die off the horse. Am I in such a great rush to die? Which I think applies to his earlier talk of not being afraid of death, as well as to his current talk of not wanting to fall off the horse. But he slows down a bit, and he decides to wait for a bit to let Ghost catch up, because this entire time John's been riding the horse and Ghost has been following on foot, or rather on paws, which has got to be exhausting for a doggo. I mean, can Ghost really not fit on the back of his horse or something? You'd think. Anyway, but John waits for Ghost to catch up, and you got to wonder if maybe John is also waiting for his friends to catch up subconsciously, because that's what happens. John's friends have come to fetch him. Gren, Pip, Toad, Sam, all those guys who were originally his enemies. The first few were his enemies, but who he had won the friendship of by showing a bit of compassion and teaching them how to fight and finding common ground. Those former enemies, now his friends, have come to take John back to the Night's Watch. And so Ghost is sighted by the other Night's Watchmen, and that's what allows these brothers to find John. Traitor, Ghost thinks. John thinks of Ghost for revealing him. You wonder if, again, there's some kind of magical spookery where Ghost is somehow recognizing that John does need to be caught by his Night's Watch brothers in order for his mystical destiny to be fulfilled. Whenever an animal does anything in this book, or in any book, really, you've got to think that there's some kind of mystical purpose behind it. Whenever a dog barks, it's for a reason. In fiction, it means there's a Terminator around the corner, you know? It means that there's an earthquake coming. Whereas in real life, when dogs bark, it just means that, like, a possum farted somewhere. And so the Night's Watch brothers surround John, and it's 1 against 7. John threatens, like, I will fight my way through you if I have to, because I'm a tough strider, outsider bastard man. And you can't keep me, but they're like, nah, you taught us to fight, and we're using those skills against you now to bring you back to the Night's Watch. And John's like, I belong with my brother Rob, and Gren is like, we're your brothers now. So it relates back to that identity struggle. They're saying that we are your family now, and so they get all dramatic, and they quote the Night's Watch oath, I shall live and die at my post, it shall not end until my death, I'm the sword in the darkness, blah, 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 and the guys circle around John. And it's almost reminiscent of when the White Walkers kill Waymar Royce, circling around him in the cold, closing in like that, but the connotations, of course, are very different here. And so basically they drag him back to Castle Black. His friends at the Night's Watch convince him that, like, look, you swore the oath, you're part of the Night's Watch, you got to come back with us. And John consents, but deep down he's still planning to ride south and return with the Starks again. He thinks that, all right, you can haul me back, but you can't keep me. I'll desert later, he thinks. But that changes later on when John has a conversation with Jor Mormont. So it begins with Jor getting his breakfast in the morning, and Jor notices that John is a bit sleepy. He's a sleepy snow because he's been out at late galloping when he should be snoozing. And we get the food description, of course, of the eggs and the plums and the bread and the ham, which is a great breakfast, I would think. And the bird is saying corn, corn, corn. He's having some beer. He's having beer for breakfast. What a fucking baller. He's also putting lemon in his beer, Jor Mormont does, because, and he says that that's the reason why he still has his own teeth, is because the lemon in his beer. So that gives us a sense of just how far Westerosi medicine has advanced. Or maybe Jor is right. Who knows? I wouldn't judge. Anyway, so he's having brekkie, and Mormont reveals that he knows that John was out riding last night. He knows that he tried to desert the Watch, and he says that the things we love destroy us every time. He'd said that before. He's quoting himself. Nothing wankier than quoting yourself, Jor. But he does, and he reveals that he knew about the ride, and he basically talks about how, well, they argue about John's motivations trying to desert. And John's like, oh, I'm not afraid to die, I'm Biggie Smalls, ready to die. And Jor's like, look, it doesn't actually make any sense for you to go fight like that. Like, you're one bloke. You can't help in Robb Stark's war meaningfully. And I see what you mean, because like I love my Mormont family just like you love your Stark family. He mentions Mage Mormont, his sister. But he talks about how ultimately your place is here. Your place is here at the Night's Watch because you're a man of the Night's Watch. And he talks about the sort of mystical threats of the White Walkers, and he reminds him of the dead, and he reminds him of Benjen out beyond the wall. And he talks about the mystical connection that the Starks have with the whole sort of cosmic battle between the White Walkers, the living and the dead. He talks about the blood of the first men flowing in the veins of the Starks. He says that beast of yours, the direwolf, is a symbol of Jon's mystical connection to all of this stuff. Jor says that I think you, Jon, were meant to be here at the Night's Watch, and I want you with me when we go beyond the wall to fight the wildlings. We're going on a ranging. It's going to be great. Invite. Are you coming? Yes, no, maybe. And Jon says yes. He's convinced. He's convinced by this talk of mystical threat. And he's going to be a part of the Night's Watch. He decides that, okay, I'll finally consent to making this my home, making this my identity. I am a man of the Night's Watch. And that's how the chapter ends. So this is a resolution of Jon's initial character struggle. We were introduced to this boy who was like, I want to be part of the Starks, but I can't be because I'm a bastard. Catelyn Stark keeps giving me the stink eye. How am I going to find some new place to be happy? Some place where I can have an identity that means something to me. Where can I find a home? He decides the Night's Watch is that place. Then he turns up and he's like, wow, the Night's Watch actually sucks. Everyone's stinky. But then they're like, oh, these mean kids, I can actually make friends with them, and I can see some value in them, and I can make friends with Sam, and I can make friends with Gren and Pip. But even then, he's like, oh, but I still feel connected to my Stark identity. I want to ride off to war with Robb. But then Jor argues that, no, your duty's here because there's all this mystical flim-flam going on with the White Walkers. And pretty much for the rest of the series, that becomes central to Jon's whole life purpose. For the rest of the series, he dedicates himself to protection of the realm, protection of the world, protection of the living against the dead. And this is the chapter in which that becomes solidified. Although you've got a wander at the end of Dance when Jon dies, will that change? How will Jon view his life's purpose after his life has been ended? It's hard to say. But what is easy to say is that was a fun chapter. And that's the end of Game of Thrones Alt Swift X Abridged 71. I hope you enjoyed. We should acknowledge that there are cool things happening on the community pages of the Swifty Squad. There's links to that YouTube channel in the description if you would like to check that out. Truly some wonderful and strange things happening there. And we'll have more episodes soon. So we were a little delayed on the schedule, but there's a couple of episodes left in this book, and so I think we'll get them out soon-ish. What does soon mean? I don't know, man. Who even knows anymore? The dictionaries are dark and full of terrors. So on that note, thank you for listening. Hope you enjoyed, and have a lovely week. Cheers.